Thank you very much for attending today. My name is Vasilios Chrysohos, Mr. Chrysohos, and today we have a wonderful guest that's going to introduce you to the world of an ancient Greek hoplite. That is a citizen soldier from a long time ago, back in ancient Greece, the archaic and classical periods. The founder's name is, that's going to be doing the presentation today, is called Mr. Andrew Yamamoto. I'm going to tell you a few words about the Hoplite organization. This is called a reenactment organization. They do living history. They're based on the East Coast of the United States, and their mission is to accurately portray the hoplite men-at-arms citizen soldiers of the Greek city-states from the archaic and classical eras. That's between 650 BC to 323 BC. They're an informal muster of veteran reenactors. It includes authors, historians, educators, curators, and craftsmen who all bring their specific expertise to the authentic presentation, not just of the hoplite's equipment and battlefield tactics, but also his culture. So now I'm introducing to you Mr. Andrew Yamamoto.
I've been a reenactor for many years. For like 23 years, I've been reenacting different eras. I've done ancient Rome, I've done the American Civil War, World War II, World War I. These are all different kind of branches from the same tree of depicting armies and depicting history by kind of getting inside it, literally getting inside the uniforms, the equipment that the soldiers wore. And it's especially interesting with ancient Greece because we are figuring things out, even by just making the stuff and putting it on. We are learning about how the Greeks fought, that in a way that the professors looking through old Greek manuscripts could never figure out. You know, we like to, it's kind of pretentious, but some of our guys call it experimental archaeology. You know, no one has ever put this stuff on before we made it. There aren't too many of us doing this, you know. In other eras, there are so many reenactors. You've heard of like Civil War reenactments. Those are huge. You get 10,000 guys on the battlefield, and they're really recreating full-size battles. Greek reenactors are much thinner on the ground. Most of what we do is stuff like this, living history presentations where we try and make it come alive and show you the stuff that, the material history that these people live with. So the really essential point in history, I think, is what I like to think of as the emergence of the soldier, right? The soldier is, when we think of our soldiers today, we think of men and women who are fighting on behalf of something greater, something bigger than themselves, for the United States of America, for whatever country they're from. And I think the hoplite represents that transition from the warrior fighting for glory. These guys cared about glory too, but it's more about fighting for their community. And the whole way they fought, the nature of the equipment they had, feeds into that system where it's not about personal glory anymore. It's not about calling out your opponent and dueling him on the field of honor. It's about holding your place in line and fighting as a community against another community. Okay, so that's the most abstract stuff, just to sort of set up the era we're talking about here. I'd like to sort of get into some of the equipment that they wore. As I said, this is expensive enough in 2022. I've made a lot of it, but I've also had to purchase some of it. I've customized everything I've purchased, but it represents a big investment. And for an ancient Greek farmer, it would have been a huge investment. But it's this stuff would have been their most valuable possessions. It would have been hanging above the hearth, polished to a high sheen, and pulled down whenever it was necessary. And when was it necessary? Why was it necessary? Who were the Greeks fighting? Well, we've already talked about 300, right? The Battle of Thermopylae, where the Greeks were fighting against the Persians. But most of the time through this era, they're not fighting against non-Greeks, or as they call them, the barbaroi, the barbarians, the other. I mean, the barbaroi literally means like, you know, barbaroi, the people who say baba, you know, government gibberish. So they weren't even concerned with that. They were fighting each other. Each of these city-states was fighting against the city-state that was next to it. If you know anything about Greece, and I bet a lot of you have been there, right? Anyone? Who's been to Greece?
I was born in Greece.
Oh, look at this. Tons of you. Okay, well, so you know that Greece is a very mountainous country, right? Most of it is mountains, you know? But you can't do anything with mountains. Maybe you can graze some sheep. It's very beautiful, but mountainous areas are usually pretty poor. And because you can't cultivate it. And so the Greek city-states were all tended to be based on in the small areas of flat land where you could actually plant crops. And because that land was so scarce, city-states were constantly vying with each other for their borderlands, basically. It's something that you go to war about pretty regularly. And it's, perhaps even once a year against the same people, year after year. You'd form up, you'd go out there, you'd form phalanx, which I'm going to show you in a little bit here. The kind of formation they form to meet the enemy. And at an appointed place and time, often the same battlefield that you've been fighting over for generations. Maybe your father fought there, your grandfather. Or maybe you're all fighting together. A city-state would draw a hoplite levy. In other words, it's basically it's draft from all the men who could afford armor, ages 18 to 60, right? So you could very well be fighting with your son, with your father. You're certainly going to be fighting with your friends. Everyone you know in your community, everyone in your peer group is forming up in a phalanx to take on the phalanx of the opposing city-state that you're fighting. And the reason that they fought this way was because it was decisive. This is not ambushes. This is not. This is about deciding a dispute in one day. Because these aren't professional soldiers, right? These guys are farmers. Maybe they're tradesmen, but they've got other things to do. They can't go off and fight a war for months at a time. They're not going out to conquer new lands that would take years or even decades. They've got stuff to do. When the Athenian army formed up, the call that went out in the Agora, the town square, was 3 days rations. What that meant was, okay, have your slave, because these guys did have slaves. Have your slave, pull your armor down, get it shined up, load up your mule with enough food for 3 days, basically like a weekend warriors. And we're going to go over the mountain pass to fight the city next to us over that field again. And this is a pattern of warfare that went on for hundreds of years. You'd meet, the sides would form up, they'd smash into each other, and it would be probably a very brief battle at that. Unbelievably ugly, bloody, but very quickly you'd have a winner and you'd have a loser. And the winner would erect a trophy. That's actually where we get the word, because it goes back to the ancient Greek word for turn, trophy, a turning point. So the point of the battlefield where the enemy line broke is where you erect basically kind of a scarecrow made of nailed together armor that you covered from your enemy's dead bodies. That would be your trophy. That's where we get the word. And the losing side would basically concede that they had lost by asking permission to bury the bodies of their dead. This would all be done in a day, and then everyone gets to go home. So it's a kind of a limited warfare. It's not about extermination. These cities weren't wiped off the face of the map. They fight each other generation after generation. Some are ascendant, some go down. Every once in a while, someone's wiped out entirely. But generally, it's a way of limiting warfare, restricting its destructiveness. You don't want to destroy the crops of the enemy. You want the crops, right? So it's an interesting approach to war, very different from what we have today. But I'm not sure it's such a bad idea. I tell you what I like best about it is that these guys had to buy their own stuff. You had to pay for the privilege of fighting in the phalanx of the country. Rich guys in front. And it really was that. The promocori, the frontline guys, that was the highest names. That was certainly where the leadership, the most powerful, charismatic members of the community would be. And they would be the most likely to die. One of the things that's really amazing about Greek military archaeology is that we have so many artifacts that have survived. We have so many more bronze pieces of Greek armor, thousands of helmets. We have more of that than we do of the Roman Empire, which was much bigger, many more soldiers, many more suits of armor out there in the Roman Empire, even than the Middle Ages. And the reason for that is that bronze survives. You can bury bronze and it'll get tarnished. It might corrode a little bit, but iron will have rusted away long ago. And so we have this incredible material inheritance that we can use to make reproductions that are very accurate.
So you'll notice that these greaves have, there's a slit up the back, but there's no straps. There's nothing holding it on aside from the fact that these are made custom to your legs. So I actually commissioned a bronze smith in Poland to make these. I we made casts of our legs. My buddy and I sent in those casts, and he sent back a few months later these greaves that he had made to perfectly fit our legs. And it's the only way to get them custom made. It's the only way to get a proper fit, because there's nothing else holding them on. And you see all these arming scenes, these movements I'm going to go through to put on the armor. You see them all the time on pottery. You know, that's the other side of Greek archaeology that's so amazing. Not only do we have a lot of the armor that survived, all the bronze stuff, but we have all the pottery. And so, and you know these Greek pots, right? They're beautifully illustrated with very precise line drawings showing all sorts of scenes from life, and especially war. So that's a kind of visual record that again, we don't have for Rome. We don't have even for the Middle Ages. We have this exquisite, sharp, focused, very detailed view of what the Greek would look like from their pottery, which, like bronze, just happens to last forever. Kind of mysterious. I wouldn't have thought that pottery is so durable, but it is. So anyway, you see pots where they're doing these motions. You just sort of pry it open and you stick it on your leg like that. Okay, so my legs are now armored. Actually, I should stop and talk a little bit about the clothes on the leg first. So this hat is called a petasos. And this, let me tell you, especially having spent a week under the Greek sun wearing this stuff, this is probably the most important piece of the kit over there, because that sun is hot. It was like close to 100 degrees for the whole day that we were there, so you have to have a sun hat. And they're this kind of weird little flat shape that actually ends up being quite practical, because you got this little strap that hooks around back here, and this pulls around in front, so the wind can blow and it stays on your head. So I've actually really come to love this thing, although my wife won't let me wear it around town. Okay, the next thing here, this is a chlamys. What this is a cloak, obviously, that's very associated with travelers and soldiers. And the reason for that is this is basically your blanket, right? It's made of wool, and I've got mine folded over double. Well, actually, let me show you first. It's weighted on the corner. You've got these little bronze weights, and that's to keep it hanging down, to let it drape nicely. The Greeks cared about this sort of thing. It's also practical. It keeps it down. It doesn't blow up around you. It keeps it down, keeps the heat in cold weather. And it is just a big blanket. It's folded double, but it's just a big rectangular cloth. And I can open it up, and it's a full blanket, and I can sleep in it. So that's basically my bed bag. The next garment here is the chiton. This could be made out of linen or wool. This one's wool. And again, like the chlamys, this is an uncut piece of fabric. It's just one big rectangular cloth folded down over, right? And then wrapped around the body, stitched up one side, and then that top hem, you sort of put your pins in here, and it creates. So you can see what this would look like normally. You're defining your armholes with the pin. So this is a very, very simple garment. Both men and women wore it. Most older men and women would wear it longer, but it's basically the same garment. The idea is the same. It's not tailored clothing. It's draped clothing. And you can understand really, like when you tailored clothing, right? There's a lot of waste, right? Anyone like ever done any sewing? Have you ever made a dress or anything like that? You know that you lay your pattern out on cloth, you cut out all the pieces, and there's a lot of wasted stuff. Well, in the ancient world, cloth was extremely valuable. It was all woven by hand. That was one of women's most important roles, aside from raising kids. And so this shorter version, actually, this is not the chiton. This is the chitoniskos, which I think just means short little chiton. And this is what soldiers wore underneath their armor, if they wore any armor at all. Like I should say before I get into I brought all the stuff to show you. And I like having all the stuff, and I like wearing all the stuff. But a lot of these Greek hoplites did not wear all this armor. The three things that you had to have to be a hoplite is your shield, your helmet, and your spear. Everything else is optional. And there were times throughout the classical era where they were wearing, lots of bronze armor, and then that sort of fell out of fashion, and then it came back into fashion. But those three things, the helmet, spear, and the shield, are what really defines a Greek hoplite, or hoplite. If I were going to put on armor, I brought two different kinds. I made both of these. Actually, I'm making this one. It's a work in progress, but I'm pretty proud of it, so I wanted to show you. This is kind of the older style. It's made of bronze. It's got two faces to it. Very heavy. Afterwards, you can come up and handle all this stuff if you want. And it's actually not as uncomfortable as you think, because it's designed, again, like the greaves, to fit my body exactly. I don't quite have abs like that, but a little augmentation is fine. Because that is so expensive to do them. And again, just imagine in a primitive world where smelting bronze at all is difficult, to get the quantity to smelt down that metal, to pound it out into large sheets, to make it into armor is incredibly expensive. And it's also very heavy, it's very hot, so they developed this other style of armor here. Oh wait, I'm sorry. I don't think I finished making a point about the clothes, which is that they didn't want to waste any of the cloth that they had woven. That was sort of the piece of cloth. You'd have a nice edge on it. Sometimes they'd weave in other patterns. It was a sumptuous skill in itself, and no one felt the need, to make sewing garments out of it. Pants were something that barbarians wore. Civilized people wore beautiful cloth and just draped it around their bodies. So that's pretty universal. All right. So getting back to the armor here, this is what's called, we call it a tube and yoke cuirass. And the reason for that is you kind of got a tube. It's a two-piece thing. You got this tube here, and then you got the yoke that fits around over top of it. And this is one of these things that's attested in thousands of vases. There are many different varieties of them. We know exactly what they all look like. We have no idea what they were made of. Some organic material that, unlike bronze, has not survived. So some people think they were made of leather. Some people think they were made of linen. Actually, the only examples we have were made of iron, but that's pretty atypical. That was a king's armor. That was Alexander the Great's father who had that armor. So that one's not really representative. This is my guess, based upon a variety of archaeological cues we've gotten in just a minute about how this stuff might have been worn. This is based on a leather core that's been wrapped in linen. And linen is actually a very tough fiber, and especially if you layer it over top of each other. That's what modern bulletproof vests are, basically, just densely woven fabric. They're using Kevlar now and not linen. But the idea is the same. That you put enough linen together, that's going to actually protect you from cuts and thrusts. So this has got both the rigidity of leather and the shape of leather, but also the protectiveness of linen. And I'm going to put it on right now. This might take me a minute. First of all, it's debatable whether or not they even wore shoes, because in the vases, they're almost always barefoot, But I got to say, having been to Greece, and you guys know, that is not a country you want to walk around barefoot in. That is very prickly and scrubby, and I mean, even if your feet were toughened up, I don't think that's something that you want to fight barefoot in. I think they wore sandals. We do know that they had leather sandals like this that have hobnails like that. These are iron nails for traction. This is what you use for traction until the middle of the 20th century when rubber soles replaced them. But I think a sandal like this, we know they had them, even though the artwork shows them barefoot. But I think what that is an artistic convention. They are the artists in rendering them, because the Greeks loved their form. They loved the nude. They found the human body was beautiful. They wanted to depict it in all its natural glory. They did it so well. They did it better than anyone until the Renaissance. Basically, what the Renaissance means is the rediscovery, the revival of ancient culture and ancient knowledge. So I think when they did their artwork, they wanted to, it was a way of heroically presenting the subject. And half the time the subject is, Hector or Achilles or the gods themselves. Or very rarely was it even like, battle that had just happened. This is heroic art showing warriors heroically. So I think that's why they're shown barefoot. That's why they're shown naked, because there's just something very essential and elemental about that. You see these figurines, and they're wearing their helmet and their shield and their breastplate and their greaves, and they are otherwise naked. And that seems a very strange way to fight, but it's pretty powerful too. Nothing but bronze. You're wearing nothing but bronze. The way this goes on, and again, this is one of these scenes that you see depicted in artwork a lot. The arming, the wrapping of the cuirass. It just sort of ties on the side like this. This is not something that you can do at the drop of a hat. It takes a little time to get ready. But you got to remember, again, the way these guys fought, let's go back to that 3 days ration thing, all right? So you've got your mule loaded up with your stuff. You've got your slaves helping you. You're not a soldier like this, like carrying all this stuff on a backpack. You are a rich Greek dude, a wealthy farmer or whatever, who is walking along with his spear, maybe with his helmet, because that's cool. But everything else, the spear, the shield, is being carried by slaves. And it's carried by slaves until right before the moment of battle. We read about this all the time in accounts. That, this stuff is heavy. You don't want to be, you can barely breathe in that helmet. You don't want to be wearing a shield. It's very heavy. You don't want to be carrying it. So they're facing the enemy. It's like a sporting event. There's the opposite team. You're on the same battlefield you've been at a million times before. You are, you're taking your time getting suited up because the battle's going to start at this time, more or less probably, and you can take your time getting suited up, or being suited up by your slave probably. This all does change later. We'll talk about kind of the world and place it is. So all right, so now I've got my cuirass on. Some people call it a linothorax, those who believe that it was made of leather, or linen rather. Thorax just means chest or armor. And some people call it a spolas, if they think it's made of leather. Like I said, I sort of hedged my bets and made it up. But you can see it's pretty protective. They call these pteryges, feathers, and they're not really there to protect your legs. They're just there to give you some motion so you can duck down. We have done tests where we sort of made patches of this kind of armor and see if we could put our spears through them. And you can absolutely put your spears through. It's a bit scary. But that's like bulletproof vests. Those don't necessarily stop bullets either. It doesn't mean that they're not doing something, right? Oh, you know what? I meant to get this started earlier. I've got a couple helmets here. I'm going to actually pass this one around. You can look at it while I'm talking here. This was made by the same Polish armorer that made my greaves. It's a recent commission. It's based on one that actually exists in the Met Museum. So you can go to the Met Museum right here in New York and see this helmet. It looks a little bit different because that one has some ribble holes that you think were put on later. But don't worry about fingerprints, but just go and drop it. Next part. And by the way, this whole armor is called the panoply, and basically the panoply just means it's all your tools of war. Just like it's kind of the same root as Hoplite, man at arms. These are the tools of war, and the panoply is all your tools, all your stuff. So this sword, this is a secondary weapon. Like I said, the spear is the main weapon. We'll get to that. But you did want to have a sidearm, and you keep it up very high underneath your arm. Because remember, this arm is going to be holding the shield. But if something happens to your spear, you can reach down here Let's pull this thing out. So this is called Hoplite, which basically means a chopper, obviously. This is a type of sword that we see throughout the Mediterranean. It's a kind of sword that Alexander the Great carried with his armies into India. It probably exists in a related form in the Nepalese kukri. So it's just one of these sword types that proved very popular. It's not it's not something you fence with. This is a hacking sword. This is very blunt. This is a limb remover. But again, it's only a secondary weapon. Probably the most important part of the Hoplite's panoply, and the one that gives him his whole name, is the shield. And this is called an Hoplite or an aspice. So you keep a cover on it, probably keep it nice. This is my aspice. As you can see in the back, it's made of wood. In the movies, they want you to think at 300, it looks like they're just throwing around massive bronze plates. And a lot of these shields did have very, very thin bronze sheets, bronze cladding on the front. But it's fundamentally a wood shield, like all shields really are through the Middle Ages. It's made of layers of wooden planks that are sort of set at cross purposes, and that makes for a very strong shape. If you guys know anything about engineering, you know that a dome or an arch is a very strong shape, right? That's why they're used in buildings, because an arch is distributing the force to the sides. And for that reason, these shields are also made with that dome. It makes them very strong. Yes. We have done some experiments, and Greek and Persian arrows were pretty weak compared to the arrows that they were using in the Middle Ages. And so I think this would have been pretty good defense against arrows. Certainly the armor would have been very good defense against arrows. And you gotta remember, these battlefields are full of flying things in the air. You got arrows, you have javelins, which is a throwing spear. You've got sling stones. Sling stones, like David used to kill Goliath, are not appreciated today as the very lethal weapon that they are. Those are very simple things. It's basically a hemp sling. It's like a rope with a little kind of basket on the end. You put a lead shot in that, or a stone, and a couple swings like that, and you can send that thing flying with a velocity that will bury itself in flesh if it hits you. They call them bullets, and that's where our term bullet comes from. Yes?
Why is there a dog on the...
Well, that's a good question. That's always one of the first questions we get at our presentations, because people walk up and they see my shield, and they see the other guys' shields, and they're all different. And they say, what's the meaning of the shield? The short answer that we always have to give them, and this is often the answer to a lot of questions we get, we don't really know. We have educated guesses. We know that at some point later on, towards the end of this era that we're talking about, the shields were starting to be issued by the state because wars had gotten bigger, right? And armies had gotten bigger, and you needed to fill the ranks, and you were kind of running out of rich people who could afford to equip their stuff. So Athens, we know at some point, started issuing shields. Like when you were 18, you did your 2 years service, at the end of which you were given a spear and a shield that probably had like an alpha for Athens on it. The Spartans famously may have had a shield that had a big lambda for Laconia, which is the region that Sparta was in. Again, it's all about the base of it. Even if the shield rim or the shield face of its bronze has survived, nothing that was painted on there has. So we only have to look at pottery, and they're always different, right? They're often animals. These could have been the individual hoplite spirit animal. It could have been a family crest. It could have been a communal thing. It could have been a trade insignia. You see all sorts of weird ones. Some of them are comical. Some of them are absolutely, there's vases where we have guys, hoplites with shields, that have pooping dogs on them. So there are some pretty ridiculous ones. This one, I personally believe that, at least in the era that I'm depicting, where I as a hoplite would have bought all this myself, and it would have been invested with personal meaning and significance, I wanted to have something that had personal meaning and significance to me. So I painted my dearly departed dog, Uraka, who died a few years ago at age 19. He was the fastest dog in Brooklyn for most of that time. But I painted him on there, so he's sort of my spirit animal. He's with me, in fact. Like I said, this one is rimmed with bronze, but it wouldn't have to be. Sometimes, it all came down to what you could afford. We have some shield facings where the whole thing's covered in bronze, and that bronze is beautifully tooled with repoussé, and so it's like a relief. Anyway, the way the shield is carried, you've got this part here, which is called the forpax. You thrust your arm through that and grab that handle, the antilabe, the foregrip, right there. And then you can see how well protected you are when you're facing the enemy. I have my helmet on, I've got my shield, I've got my greaves. I'm pretty invulnerable. And I'm going to want to be pretty invulnerable because the type of battle I'm walking into is going to be absolutely terrifying. And it's time to pull out the helmet here. So, first off, you're all getting a look at the helmet. Pretty heavy, right? But not too bad. You need some sort of liner, right? So this is a guess at what that liner would have been. Because again, organic stuff doesn't survive. It's just not an artifact that we have. But we did find one helmet, incredibly enough, in a shipwreck in the Aegean Sea a few decades ago that had the remnants of a woven brass basket in it. I don't know how that survived underwater for so long. I guess there's no oxygen to feed the microbes, but that gave us the idea to make these. And so, along with leather working and bronze working, basket making is one of the crafts that I've learned to be able to put together this impression together. This is just grass, it's raffia grass, and you weave it together, videos on YouTube, and that sort of fits on your head as a liner. Stuff it inside the helmet. And so you can see this helmet, the one I'm sending around that's how it came from the armor. With this one, I've put in a leather liner. I put some padding under the cheek plate, so it kind of fits like a motorcycle helmet. And if you get hit in the front of the head, there's some padding. So it's pretty protected. So this is how that helmet goes on. As you'd like to. Like if you were a general addressing the troops, you probably couldn't do it with this helmet on. So what you often see, especially in statues of generals, like Pericles or the statues of Athena, the way that you kind of wear it like this. Sort of like football players, right? They just push the helmet back on the back of their head. And this is what you see in statues again and again, yes. Well, they're actually not feathers. This is a horsehair crest. And again, we don't know exactly what the significance was, if there was any sort of meaning to them. I kind of tend to think that you did whatever looked cool to you, or you bought whatever looked cool to you from your local helmet guy. Yes? Oh, no way. No way. A bullet would go straight through that. Absolutely go through that too. I think even a spear would go through that if you got it on force. But again, just remember what a dangerous place the battlefield is. You've got sling bullets, you've got arrows, you've got javelins, you've got arrows and javelins and sling bullets bouncing off other people's armor. So it's kind of coming from all over, and even if it can't stop a full spear thrust, you're going to be glad to have some sort of armor on to protect yourself. Yes? This?
Yeah. Is that design?
It looks cool, This whole crest here, this is a swan. That's based upon some base drawings. Sometimes the crest is applied directly to the helmet, but this, on earlier styles, they often had a thing that sticks up way high here. It actually makes for a kind of uncomfortable helmet, right? It's a little tippy. The center of gravity isn't so good, but they have them. You think they have them? They're certainly depicting themselves with these crests all the time, even though it's hard to fight with them. And I think the idea was that, this looks terrifying, and this makes you look even bigger. So to complete the full look here, now I'm going to talk a little about how these guys fought. And I hope I don't fall off the stage because I can't see very well. So the spear is not a javelin, right? A javelin is something you throw. This is a thrusting spear. And what makes it specifically a thrusting spear, the reason you can't really throw it very well is because it's specifically designed to be rear-weighted, okay? So you have the tip, which again, you can see it's a different color than the armor, right? That's iron. That's razor sharp. That's the cutting edge, literally, of Greek technology. They've just figured out how to make spearheads that can go right through rocks, right? But they haven't figured out how to make iron armor that can stop it. So that's one of those things, you know, the history of warfare is constantly a history of offense and defense. It's an arms race. They're balancing out. They're trying to keep up with each other. So that's the cutting edge. Does anyone know what this might be for?
That's behind you.
Anyone? Yes?
Stabbing someone behind you?
Well, but who's going to be behind you?
I don't know.
Your own guys, right? We've struggled a lot with this because they clearly show them on spears. What this is called a serotor, which basically is a lizard, which means it's a lizard sticker. So if you can imagine yourself on a sun-baked Greek plain, you know, these battles are always in the summer and the hot weather. You know, there's a lizard kind of walking between you as you're in a ranks, and you just stick them. It's useful for killing wizards. It might also be useful for just sticking in the ground. Like I really wish I could stick this in the ground right now because then it wouldn't be falling over all the time. But the main thing it's there for is as a counterweight. So bronze, I told you before, is a little heavier than iron. And this is a bigger chunk of it than the spear point in the head, which is why the balance point is back here, right? It's not in the middle. And the reason for that is when I'm in phalanx, when I'm fighting, I want as much of that spear sticking out in front of me as possible. Because the way that these phalanxes are fighting, right, you're not fighting as an individual soldier. Now remember going back to what I said at the very beginning about how, you know, this is not single combat, right? You're forming as part of a phalanx. Now I'm going to get back to really explaining what a phalanx is. This is a very unwieldy system of combat. This is not optimized for single fighting. You know, if you were fighting as an individual, you probably want a shield that you could hold with one arm that you could punch out with. You can't punch out with this. It's too heavy to do that. What this is for is forming a shield wall. You know, you can well, by the way, part of the reason this has got a dome like this is so you can actually rest it on your shoulder. That takes off some of the 17 or 18 pounds that this thing weighs. Yes?
How sharp is that?
That is razor sharp. That's why you guys are way back there in case this thing falls off again. This would go right through you, like a hot knife through butter, all the way through. But so you're fighting in a phalanx, which means that you are overlapping your shield. You are standing shoulder to shoulder next to your community. You're probably ranked about 8 guys deep. This varied over time and with different armies. Basically, the standard, we think, was about 8 ranks deep. So there are 8 rows of guys behind you. So like the Athenian phalanx, when it fought at Marathon, was like 9,000 men that Athens was able to raise from its property landowning farmers to march out and meet the Persians who had just landed at Marathon. Figure out like how deep it was. So 9,000 guys. This shield is about a meter wide, right? So if you've got, let's say you've got a space 1,000 meters wide to cover. And that's about a marathon, what you see between the 2 mountains that the Greeks formed out between. That means you've got about 1,000 guys with their meter-wide shield defending that line. And if there are, let's say there's 8,000 or 9,000 of these guys, all the rest of them are ranking up behind. So you've got 1,000 men wide and 8 ranks deep. That gives you an idea of how big one city-state's phalanx was. And there were some battles that were much bigger than that. There were some battles, especially against the Persians, where the Greek city-states who were usually at each other's throats actually banded together to face the common threat. And the Battle of Plataea that I went to Greece this last summer to reenact was one of those battles. So you actually had Athens and Sparta, who were blood enemies, and would go right back to killing each other as soon as they had defeated the Persians. But they formed together, and their phalanx was like 80,000 guys. When you get all the little city-states contributing 1,000 guys here, 100 guys here, you get these massive numbers. You can just imagine what does 80,000 hoplites, hoplites, outfitted like me, look like? What does that even sound like? The clink of armor and the stamp of hoplite, with clouds of dust being picked up, right? This is a massive endeavor. And you're facing it at very close range. So, I'll put my helmet down here. So this. The reason you're holding it back here, you can see that it sort of tips a little forward. Right? I've got the center of gravity on this spear a little bit forward of where my grip is, so it wants to bend up. And why is that a good thing? Why is it a good thing for my spear to be like this instead of like this? So you are the guys behind me, right? Because I've got 8 guys behind me, or 8,000 as the case may be, and I'm just trying to stab like this, keeping that end up high in the air, so I'm not killing the guys behind me. And the guys behind me are doing the same thing. Certainly the next rank behind me is doing exactly the same thing. And the rank behind him is probably doing exactly the same thing. Beyond that, the other guys they probably have their spears up, they're waiting for their turn, probably hoping it doesn't come. Because you're not rotating, right? There's no whistle that gets blown where you take a break and the next guy takes his turn in the front line. If you're in the front, you're in the front for the duration of the battle, until you die or until the lines pull apart. But basically, it's a do or die sort of situation. You can't run away. And think about this: you wouldn't even want to run away, right? Your dad is next to you, your son is next to you, your family, your entire community. You are fighting with them. It's no one wants to be the person to break ranks and run. And it's a very simple type of battle. These were untrained guys. These are not professional soldiers. They didn't even really drill. They might have practiced their marching a little bit to be able to kind of get around the battlefield. But the big exception to this is the Spartans, right? And this whole story I've been talking about, it doesn't really apply to the Spartans. They're kind of the outliers. You've got Sparta, and then you've got everyone else. Spartans were different. They trained their elite class warrior to be full-time warriors. They trained all the time. The reason they were able to train all the time is because they had an enslaved Greek population who was doing all their work for them. So, they were tough, but they were even more than most Greeks. They were slave owners. But for most Greeks, they weren't trained. You don't really, what sort of training is there? We've got Greek accounts that say basically a child knows how to use a spear, a child knows how to carry a sword. When all you're doing is in a massive scrum like this with all these guys pressing up behind you, and you're face to face. I'm like right here with this guy in front of me. You stood in the line, and maybe you died or you didn't, but you did your bit for your country. And they were very proud of this. Every Greek that you've ever heard of, Socrates, Aeschylus, these guys proudly served in their phalanxes. Aeschylus is one of the greatest playwrights in ancient Greece, one of the 3 great playwrights of classical Athens. And his gravestone says that here lies Aeschylus, who fought at Marathon when he was a young man. Makes no mention of the fact that he was like the biggest celebrity in ancient Greece as a playwright. It's just that he was a soldier. He fought with his phalanx. Socrates was a famously brave soldier before he was an old man philosopher. So this was just something that you did. It was part of being a man, and certainly being part of a man with enough means to be part of this combat system. So this whole system this whole world that I've described to you we're basically talking about an era of, say, 700 BC. That's kind of when the hoplite emerged as a type of soldier and the city-state emerged as a political entity. I really want to talk a little about the politics of it. Because if you go back to those Trojan War, those Bronze Age heroes that I talked about before, those were chieftains, right? They're chieftains with their bands of vassals and warriors who fought for them and got rewards and booty from their wars. But the citizen soldier hoplite of the city-state was, again, not fighting for personal glory. He was not getting any personal glory in that type of battle. It was just sort of standing in line. But he realized that the security of his city-state, the survival of his people, was no longer contingent upon princes or warlords or men wealthy enough to own horses and be cavalry. We haven't really talked about cavalry that much because they didn't really loom that large on the classical Greek battlefield. If you were really rich, you could maybe afford to have a horse and be a cavalryman. But a lot of even those rich guys preferred to do their service as a foot soldier, as a hoplite, because there was greater prestige in it, because you were going eye to eye, face to face with the enemy in a way that you wouldn't if you were just sort of scouting around on a horse. But so these hoplites realized that, like, hey, we're doing the fighting, we're doing the dying, we should get more of a say in how things are run. And you've heard about Athens being the cradle of democracy. Well, that's what it is. That's one of the major reasons that democracy came about. Because the hoplite class that guaranteed Athens' security and that of other city-states, each city-state had their own, they demanded their political due. They felt they deserved a place at the table. They deserved to vote. And man, the Greeks took it seriously, Athens in particular. There was mandatory voting. They rounded up everyone and corralled you and took you up to the Pnyx Hill, where you would hear the issues of the day, and you would have to cast your vote. There was no like, oh, I couldn't make it. No one got a sticker saying I voted, because everyone voted. You had to be a little bit more engaged with their societies. I think that's definitely something we can take away from the Greeks. But and this lasted for hundreds of years. We're talking about like 650 to about 350, 325. And what brings it all to an end is the Macedonians. Now, Macedon is to Greece kind of what Scotland is to England, right? It's this more rugged, rougher, less cultured, tougher, mountainous area to the north of the fertile, civilized culture of lowlands. And it had always been a bit of an outlier, kind of Greek, but not quite Greek, admiring Greece, but not admired by the Greeks. But to make a long story short, Philip of Macedon realized that he could finally unite the Greeks in defeat if he could put together an army that could defeat the hoplite phalanx. Because for hundreds of years, it had been unbeatable. The Persians couldn't beat it. The Persians were by far the bigger, wealthier, more powerful entity than the Greeks that it fought against. But the individual Greek soldier was so tough. Individual armored citizens facing, hordes of basically conscripts, draftees, forced to fight for, the king of Persia, whether or not they wanted to. The Greeks had something to fight for, and it made them very tough. But they had a weakness. They had a weakness, and that weakness was, as we talked about, these are citizen soldiers. These are farmers. These are not trained soldiers. They're not trained to fight in a particularly efficient way, and they're not equipped to fight far from home. So what Philip did was he created a professional army. Macedon had struck silver mines and was suddenly flush with money. He used that money to pay soldiers, to train year-round. He changed their equipment a bit. He shrunk the shield down so it could be slung over the shoulder. And he lengthened the spear so it could be twice or even 3 times as long as this one. A massive pike that you would handle with 2 hands. You can really see this very well if you ever watch the movie Alexander. Okay, that's about Alexander the Great. It's an Oliver Stone movie. Colin Farrell plays Alexander. It's got some goofy scenes in it, but the battle scenes are amazing and they're very accurate. So if you want to know what an ancient battle looked like, that's the one I'd suggest you choosing. There are a couple battles in there that are just astonishingly well done. Again, it's not quite the era that we're talking about because that's about Alexander's army. That again, his father had
sorry, get ahead of myself. So Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, created this professional army, outfitted it a bit differently, and then marched it down into Greece. Greece considered this an invasion by a foreign power, just like they had just like when the Persians had come in 200 years earlier. And once again, they put aside their differences and they formed up, and they were this time defeated. The Philip and his Macedonian army with Alexander the Great as his second in charge. He wasn't the great yet; he was just the son. But they defeated Athens and Thebes and the other Greek city-states that were lining this, and that is universally accepted as really the end of the classical Greek era. You know, they would continue on. The Greeks would continue on. They would be looked at and respected by every civilization since, especially the Romans. You know, the Romans were much more powerful than Greece ever was. I've always kind of described the relationship between Greece and Rome as the relationship between England and the United States, right? You know, we came from England, or like our civilization was kind of reported from England. But we are much more powerful than they ever were. But we still kind of look to them for a lot of our history and common traditions. And that's very much how the Romans were. They just imported Greek culture. And it has continued to be a huge part of certainly Western civilization, and I'd argue human civilization ever since. But so much of it, so much of Greek civilization that we really respect and revere, whether it's their science or their art, their theater, their poetry, their pottery, it was all guaranteed by the bravery of hoplite soldiers like I'm portraying here. You know, this is kind of true of any civilization. You've never had a great civilization that also didn't have men willing to fight to protect that culture. So I would argue that you know, as interested as I am in sort of military nitty-gritty details of all this stuff, it is really the larger historical significance that makes this, I think, worth knowing about. I think, you know, I grew up really interested in history and military history, and I painted models of all this stuff, and I painted little figures of Greek hoplites and drew pictures of them. And, you know, when you get to be a grown-up and you have a little bit of money in your pocket, and you haven't quite given up all your childish interests, or your childhood interests, I should say. You don't want to paint the little guy anymore. You want to be the little guy, right? And for me, what actually got me into this, I'd been into Greek stuff when I was a kid, definitely. But it's only recently that I actually put together the reenactment stuff for it. Like I said, I'd done a lot of different eras, but this was always kind of what I wanted to get to. But it was going to be the most expensive. It was going to take the most effort. It was going to take not living in a tiny New York apartment that didn't have room to do the crafts necessary to make this stuff. So like when we got a house in Brooklyn with a basement, that meant that I could now kind of start learning all these kind of messy things that I couldn't do at the kitchen table. So that was one of the things that made it possible. Also, I've got a 13-year-old daughter, and she was really into these Percy Jackson books, right? You guys know them. And she was really into Greek mythology, and that got me sort of really excited about it. And I made her one of these out of cardboard for a Halloween costume a few years ago. And had so much doing it, had so much fun doing it, that I was like, now I want one of those too. And so I did. This is the first thing I made was this honor, and everything else has sort of come together since. And now it's a pretty big part of my life, and a big part of my social circle. And you know, I get together with my friends, and we spend weekends living this life. You know, I bought the combat gear, but we had the whole setup. We have tents that we've sewn together from 28 goat skins. We've got, you know, we eat an authentic Greek diet. We've got all the accoutrements of daily life that all is part of our encampment display. And if anyone is interested in seeing more about this and seeing really how it happens and even how these guys fought, you know, we do these reenactment events. Some of them are even local. We just did one a couple months ago out at Bethpage Village on Long Island. We'll do another one next year. We do them in New Jersey. The big one that we're going to is down in Jamestown, Virginia. We do them in Pennsylvania, and we live here. And we have put on this stuff and gone to Prospect Park and spent an afternoon with padded spears sparring, just sort of practicing our combat moves. And that, I gotta say, if anyone's interested, male or female, because we have both in our group, if you're interested, let me know, because we are definitely recruiting. We're growing fast. We just started 2 years ago, and I think we're getting pretty close to 20 people signed up for our next big event. So it's a lot of fun.